the Institute. And finally, and last but by no means least, is my close friend and colleague, Michael Meany from McGill University. Just seeing where we are with the RCMP. What I'm going to do here is say a few words about each of our panelists, and that way I can just slip into asking them to speak without having to give the intro. Let me begin with Michael Meany. Michael has done some really outstanding work on trying to understand the importance of early life events, especially mother-child interactions, and the influence that this can have on the physiology and the neurobiology of individuals. And obviously, this has great importance for understanding how one develops into a healthy adulthood, but it also has implications for trying to understand how inappropriate mothering and inappropriate care can also have long-lasting consequences. And he's going to share some of his thoughts on this. Michael has a James McGill professorship position of medicine, and he's a full professor in the Department of Psychiatry, and in neurology, and in neurosurgery. And when he's not doing that, he's director of the program for the study of behavior, genes, and environment at McGill University. And he really is one of Canada's most outstanding neuroscientists. So we're delighted to have you here, Michael. Then Alan Young was trained in medicine and psychiatry at the universities of Edinburgh and Oxford. And he's held academic appointments at those universities, Edinburgh, Oxford, and also most recently at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, where he held the chair in general psychiatry. Now, we were fortunate enough last year to recruit Alan and his family to BC. And Alan has graciously accepted to be the Associate Director of the Institute of Mental Health at UBC, but he's also providing leadership in research on depression. And his own area of specialization is mood disorders, very broadly defined, and also schizophrenia. And he's particularly interested in the role of the hormone systems in the body, in particular the stress hormone systems, as perhaps a triggering factor in the initiation of a mood disorder episode. And he's also worked recently, done some very elegant and important work looking at clinical trials of drugs that block it's called the glucocorticoid receptor, and we think that might lead to a whole new class of antidepressant drugs. So, Alan, we're delighted to have you as a colleague and a member of the Vancouver community. And again, last but not least, going the other way, everyone's equal on this panel, we have Deepak Chopra. Dr. Chopra began his medical career as an endocrinologist and rose to distinction, through traditional means in academia. In fact, he still, every year I read on his bio, that he still participates in an internal medicine update at Harvard Medical School in the continuing education department every year. So he's maintaining this formal link with academic medicine. But of course, I think he's gained even greater distinction for being a pioneer in looking at the medical practice which takes into account the whole body and the whole mind and the whole behavioral set. And he's written extensively on this topic with over, I think, 45 books to date to his credit. And a recent one that I think builds on an understanding of happiness, to understand relationships around power and other psychological states. Dr. Chopra now heads the Chopra Center for Wellbeing, which is located in San Diego, California. And it's at this institute that he completes the training of people in this more holistic approach to medicine and to the treatment of the maintenance of health, I think is how he would put it. So, Deepak, we're delighted that you're here. Thank you very much for sharing. Okay, now I'm still waiting for that final word that His Holiness is about to come through the door. Let me just look over and find out whether he is. When might we expect him? Okay. What else do you want to know about UBC? Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Good. Thanks. Okay. So these are those moments you don't plan for. a silence. I think I'll just share an anecdote with you, another one, not like you must come and meet Uncle, but the fact that Margot and I, in preparation for this event this weekend, we were invited to go to Dharamsala and meet with His Holiness and his staff in order to give him an overview of the event that we had planned, and also there were other people in the audience with us who were there to talk about the new Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Education. And he was very gracious about our event, but he was really, really taken by this idea of creating a Center for Peace and Education in Vancouver bearing his name. And there was a lot of to and froing in the conversation, but he looked Victor Chan, I think it was, or somebody, straight in the eye, and he said, I want you to understand, I love this idea, but this isn't just going to be a think tank for academics. He said, I want action. He said that the problems that the world is facing are so severe that we need to bring the best minds in the planet together to try to start thinking in a more compassionate and caring way, not only about the problems that society is facing, but also the way in which governments are interacting, and can't we get some control over peace through action? So that was another message he was sending to us. So once this center is established in Vancouver, and I guess it's going to take a year or two to get it all in place, I think it's going to become a beacon of hope in the world. One of the reporters at lunchtime asked me, why Vancouver? What's so special about this place? Why would His Holiness choose to come here? And I think part of it is the point I made in my introductory remarks first thing this morning. There's a history of people in Vancouver and in British Columbia being willing and concerned and compassionate, reaching out to the Tibetan community. So that has left a lasting impression upon him and has brought him back now on 4 different occasions. And each time that he comes to the city, like the most recent one last year, of course, UBC and Simon Fraser gave him honorary doctorates. And he got to see a little bit more of the city, the tremendous resources that we have, the beauty of the place. And I think he was also struck by the tremendous multicultural facet of this city. The fact that multicultural communities are where the action is. That's where you get that tension amongst ideas that leads to change. And I think he recognizes that. And I think he realizes that even though we are from so many diverse backgrounds, we really do get along very well in this city. There are tensions as there are anywhere. But when you look at the people that we welcomed into the city and how well integrated the multicultural community has become, I think Vancouver is in many ways a showcase for how communities have to develop and grow in the 21st century. So I think that appeals to him as well. So you're all invited to, he promises as part of this, to make frequent visits to Vancouver. So we expect to see him every 18 months or so. I'm not sure the volunteer sector that behind this event is glad to hear that, because it takes so much work. And we're really honored and privileged to have so many people working so well behind the scenes to make this happen. But that volunteer group, the energy behind that group is what brings us into being. So we have all of the ingredients, I think, to work together to use this as a universal, a world resource, not just a Vancouver resource. So stay tuned. There's going to be many more pronouncements about the center and its plans. I certainly tend to be an advocate for UBC and Simon Fraser establishing strong links with the center and bringing people of the caliber that we have today on stage to future dialogues. I think dialoguing is a form of action, and hopefully we can develop programs for action out of the discussions that we have. So these will be ongoing. Some of them hopefully will be graced by the presence of His Holiness, and others will be graced by the presence of the minds and ideas of those we choose to invite. Okay, so I can stop ad libitum. So it's with great pleasure and humility that I invite His Holiness back on stage for the afternoon session. Thank you, Your Holiness. Thank you. Well, welcome back, Your Holiness. We trust you had a good lunch, a light lunch, and thank you again for participating in the second panel this afternoon. It says Canada, so. Now this afternoon,
Vancouver.
Vancouver, Canada, even better, yay! So, Your Holiness, we're going to go right into presentations rather than and invite your comments at the end, if we may. And the topic for this afternoon is a little different than this morning. This morning we were I think we had a wonderful dialogue around the concept of happiness, debates about definitions of emotions. And what we'd like to do this afternoon is turn the table slightly and move to the influence of stress in part and early lifehood events as determinants of later behavior and emotional well-being. And then each of the participants is going to offer a different perspective on this general idea. And we're going to proceed from Michael Meany through Alan Young to Dr. Chopra. So, Michael, if I may, could you begin the dialogue? Thank you.
I will. Thank you, Tony. It's an honor to be here. Although I'm a bit jealous of my colleagues who this morning got to represent happiness, while we got tabbed with stress. But I think, as we were speaking earlier, I think there's a good room to bring this back into where we were this morning's conversation. If I could have perhaps just a second slide of the ones I gave. There we go. Thank you. Something that's very interesting. I had watched with great interest a video of a dialogue between Your Holiness and Professor Aaron Beck, whom I'm sure many of you will notice is the originator of cognitive behavioral therapy. And what was so impressive, I think, was the overlay between Buddhist philosophy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And what I wanted to do was to try to bring that into a particular context. And it's one that we're starting to really understand in medicine. What we're understanding is that illness, many forms of illness and disease, is shaped first by events that occur early in life, and second, it is shaped by various forms of family experience. And so the slide that you're looking at is simply the results of studies across many populations, which simply show that there is an increased probability, a greater likelihood of many forms of disease in people who have a particular form of early family experience. Could I have the next slide, please? And what's becoming more apparent, and Professor Chopra, I'm sure, can comment on this, is that the relationship seems to be in part due to an influence of early family life on the degree to which people experience negative emotions such as fear and irritability and hostility, and in general show a greatly increased reaction to stress. And as many know who study in the mind-body field of medicine, these emotions render us much more likely to develop any of these particular illnesses. Now, can I have the next slide, please? The other, and this I think should be something, particularly given Professor Phillips' comments, something that is a major focus, perhaps, of the Dalai Lama Center, is that we also know that neither these diseases, these illnesses, nor these forms of family experience occur by chance. That they occur when families live under particular conditions of hardship and chronic stress. Next slide, please. So if I might, what I would like to do, following technical adjustment, what I'd like to do is to take you through just one experiment. And I'd like yourself and members of the audience to simply imagine life as a child growing up in a family with drug abuse, unemployment, financial stress, and physical and sexual abuse. And to think of the consequences, the long-term effects of that early life on the child's brain and on the reality that they see in their worlds. Now, this is a wonderful experiment. It was done by a psychologist named Seth Pollack at the University of Wisconsin. And what you're looking at, Professor Ekman will be very familiar with this, these are standard faces. And if you look from your right to your left, what you will see is that through computer technology, these faces have been altered so as to change the expression from one of fearfulness to sadness, or sadness to anger. And it's all done in various steps. And so what the experimenter is doing is to ask the subject to look at individual faces and ask what emotion they see within those faces. And the experiment had as subjects young children who were either from intact functional families or children who had been physically and sexually abused. And one more slide, please, if you will. Now, what the circles are meant to show is the difference in the perception of the children who had been physically abused compared to those who lived under intact and happier circumstances. Now, these children didn't differ in looking at sadness or happiness, but where they differed was in any facial expression that suggested anger. And what the pink circle simply reveals the point at which an abused child would perceive anger. The yellow circle indicates the point at which the child from a happier family perceived anger. And the problem here, of course, is that the circumstances of the child, the family life of the child, where they are constantly under physical threat, lead that child to be incredibly sensitive to any suggestion, any perception of anger in their parents. And emotionally, they then become people who are very sensitive to threat. And the problem that we face is that while in many of us who live under happier circumstances, will recognize that our anger is almost always wrong, that it doesn't correspond to any real threat or real danger. For these children, their anger is not wrong. It is very adaptive. It is very real. And it is very justified. And so the question I pose is that with these children who are very, as you can imagine, very preoccupied with their own health and their own well-being, is that we have created an environment in which the development of compassion and secular ethics is very difficult. And instead we've created an environment in which the child must normally be angry. And one of the problems that we face in medicine, and particularly in psychiatry, is how do we reach out to those children? How do we deal with that form of anger?
Solons was saying that, of course, even among the children who come from that very unfortunate background, might be differences. Some may be more responsive to intervention, some may be less. But the main fact is, challenging though it may be, we should never abandon them.
Oh, of course.
I think possibility, always there. Although may take longer period and need more effort. But then eventually, I think there's always possibility to change.
One of the issues in
physical,
yes. Of course, if that kind of damage is already resulting at a sort of a brain or physical level, then it's much harder to really intervene and change. But if it's primarily at the level of psychology, then perhaps there's more room for change.
Well, that's very interesting. Funny, I just happened to have a slide. One more, please. Yeah, we work well together. I'm not convinced that I would make the distinction between psychology and brain. And I'll tell you why that's the case. Now, I'm a neurobiologist, and so I will apologize that I'm going to show you some anatomy. But it's done with good intention and simple purpose. I would like to draw your attention to an area that is referred to as the prefrontal cortex. Someone you know well, Richie Davidson, works with this. Now, when we become angry, as psychologists have been pointing out for many years, we have one great refuge. It's the hope that our prefrontal cortex will remain functional to allow us to assess whether this is a realistic threat and whether or not our anger is justified. And that level of analysis we know is very psychological, of course, but we also know it occurs in the prefrontal cortex. It also turns out to be, and I think this is perhaps an area of optimism, it is, and there are many neuroscientists who have studied this now, it is an area that is physically changed in its activity in response to cognitive behavioral therapy. And I know that there has been discussion that it could be an area of the brain that is responsive to Buddhist philosophies. So I'm wondering, however it may appear ironic, that even if it has a biological base, if the most effective route to change is not through dialogue and psychological approaches.
Not through.
Is through.
Is through.
Is through.
manya mase de de go was machine de de yo is and kan da tang sen che de lo som dang 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 de 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 shen de che che de ba kong yo do yo de tong yo res de yin zang ji de ji su lu ne ga da she ne ga sa de yes ka wo na no
that is us and the that so the taber chemotherapy
it's a very complicated question because it partly touches upon one's philosophical position on the whole relationship of mind and brain.
Oh, just a bit, yeah. I'm just waiting for the other shoe to fall.
So then, the thing you also did. Number trouble to be young level part you are.
Of course, related to this is the question which Solinus was saying that he has been often asking and interested that as a result of brain changes at the brain level, there is a manifestation of changes at the psychological and emotional level. Yes, that's uncontentious. But can one also imagine the reversal process where as a result of a thought process, change in the thought process, one could see a change on the brain level as well?
I think
so there are generally a grosser level of mind and a more subtle level of mind. Mm-hmm. So grosser level of mind, naturally, you see, something like, I think, the production of brain.
Product of brain.
Product of brain. So brain change, something because the movement in the brain, and then these certain mind, you see, happen or develop. But then another level, the first movement on the mental level, it effect on brain. Now whether there is, you see, that is your dimension.
Yeah. So whether that is something, a possibility that one can envision is open to question.
Of course. I think the optimism here is that these can occur and that the dialogue involved in cognitive behavioral therapy or in Buddhist philosophy there is the prospect of changing what we otherwise think of as biological in brain.
Behavioral therapy is up to Gola. Some do what and then there's a chick or was there's a number sometime remember which is Chibushas. Kulo Yuatanje and Shine, so Nazataman, which is Pando Yukutan.
I'll leave you with just one last thought on that. It's a wonderful study, and no, I don't have a slide. I could get it. It's a wonderful experiment by Professor Charlie Nemiroff in Atlanta, who was looking at individuals who are suffering from depression. And one of the classic discussions we have in psychiatry is whether to treat depression with medications or with a psychologically based therapy. It's usually a false discussion, usually both are best. But what Charlie found out was, I thought, monstrously important. He found out that if he was treating a depressed patient who had a history of abuse, like the children of which we spoke, that cognitive behavioral therapy was much more effective than the medication. That if he treated someone with depression but no history of abuse, they generally work parallel. The drug might work a little faster, a little better. But what was particularly interesting then was that this approach, perhaps, is the approach that is most effective in the children of which we spoke, which I think might be an interesting focus for a Dalai Lama center, where intervention and action is clearly, obviously, something that's called.
The depression treatment depression samdana jo tan ba lapje de che ya lo jo du yo na tian
oh ya no jin does be samdu kan che 삼류강에 되는 것 선물 주셔야 돼요. that is 삼류강에 야 이거 조셔야. 또 지단분은 중앙만유보다 지금 내가 가네.
So this seems very, in some sense, quite logical because the depressed patient with a history of abuse in early life was, in some sense, a consequence of an environmental exposure to certain, mistreatment and also a lot of psychological anxiety and so on. So later, the treatment where, a more psychologically based therapy would work because in a sense you are reorienting the way the person would think. Exactly. Whereas the other cases of instances of depression where perhaps one could say more genetically based or biologically based or whatever, there it makes sense that it would lend itself more to a kind of medical or pharmacological treatment.
Funny, that's the way we think too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, I said this morning that we hadn't rehearsed anything, but Michael's point that he's just made, I think, will lead beautifully into the points that Dr. Alan Young would like to make. So, Alan, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and it's a great honour to be able to talk to you, Your Holiness. I learnt quite a lot this morning from listening to you talk to the experts on happiness. And I was particularly interested in your teaching on compassion and your distinction about biased compassion and unbiased compassion. And that was discussed with relation to happiness. I wonder if there are any particular parallels with compassion and ill health and illness.
Not very clear. What's your question?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different questions in there. One of them is, can we learn from illness about compassion? And the other is the nature of compassion towards illness. So there's two separate parts to it, I guess.
There is, on the level of actual cultivation of compassion, there is definitely a connection between not so much illness but suffering and compassion. Yes. Because compassion is a state of mind that wishes the other to be free of particular suffering. And the more one is aware of the nature of that suffering and its seriousness, the greater the compassion is going to be towards that person. So in that sense, there is a connection between the two. In fact, one could say that without thinking about suffering, there is no compassion, there is no room for compassion to arise. So of course, when we speak of suffering, we are talking about a wide variety of experiences. You have illness, mental unhappiness, and so on.
Buddhist literature or Buddhist viewpoint, there are generally three levels of suffering. Suffering of suffering, suffering of change, and suffering of
conditioning.
Conditioning.
Good. Thank you very much. Could I have my first slide, please? This is a study which was done internationally by the World Health Organization. It really summarizes something that's called the burden of disease, which I think really is how much suffering is caused by these individual disease categories. And this is in the West. The situation is slightly different in other countries which have more infectious diseases and so on. And it's striking that mental ill health, which is a major cause of human suffering and unhappiness, is so large. And of course, one of the things that you might see there is it's number 2, but it separates out the consequences of addictions, alcohol and drug use. And if you add those all together, this is the single largest cause of suffering due to disease. And one of the things that strikes me as a psychiatrist who's interested in this is that we feel very compassionate in the West about ill health. But I think that mental ill health somehow has less compassion directed towards it than physical ill health. And I can give you an example. We have many people in Vancouver and in Toronto and London and New York and so on who are homeless. And some of them are homeless because of mental ill health. It would be considered a scandal if someone had to sleep in the streets because they had cancer, but people sleep in the street because they have schizophrenia. I was talking to one of my students about this, about the lunch break, and I said to her, I was practicing to speak to the Dalai Lama. And I said, people with severe mental illness like schizophrenia often do better in countries like India. That's been shown. The outcome is better. And she said, but aren't many people homeless there as well? But there seems to be something different in society. There seems to be something in the West that we've lost in terms of caring for people with severe mental illness. And I'd be very interested if you had any reflections on that.
I don't know.
His owners were saying that this is something that he hasn't really paid any attention to, given thought. The contrast between the two.
Sure. Generally, my opinion or my sort of feeling is that those countries not developed much, then their physical suffering is more
immediate. More immediate.
And those society or country where material facilities better, then maybe the mental level suffering is more obvious, more serious. That's my impression, but I don't know.
Well, I think there's mental ill health in all countries, and it's true that in many countries there are such severe problems with physical health that perhaps the mental ill health is seen as being less important. But my point is that seems to be true here as well. But there seems to be something different in the way society considers mental health, and it's also arguable that in the past, in the West, we were better at this, because the phenomenon of people sleeping in the streets like this is something which has really become obvious in the last 20 years or so. And it's striking. And I think many of us are trying to understand what's happened in our society, that we seem to have less compassion for some people that are ill.
또 방법이 제일로 당 거. 그래서는 선만이.
저서가 남이신가지. 그 믹스 리서치긴 야오래. 심해시. I don't know.
This is probably an important area of special research to be done. Why this is so?
And then also I think in the West, perhaps some differences between those people who stay in big cities,
The urban areas.
than those in countryside.
Oh yes.
More like farmland. Maybe I think there are some differences. Maybe I don't know.
One comment that's been made to me by doctors from India is that they feel that in non-Western countries there's a greater feeling of interconnectedness.
Yes.
And that's perhaps one of the things that we've lost in the West. So when we go past someone that's homeless, we don't feel it has anything to do with us. And, maybe that's one of the factors. Okay. I was very interested this morning in hearing about the thoughts about happiness and mental well-being and the description of different levels of happiness and the discussion of stupid happiness and so on. It was fascinating. I'm interested in mental well-being, but I'm also interested in mental ill health. And I wonder, would you recognize there being a difference between the two?
글쎄요. 뒤지고서. 배는 누지기 때문에 있으려면 회전 가시다 섭도 하시고 영업의 상황도 줘봐서 다티 회전 섭도 하시고
Yes, just as one can speak of mental well-being, one can also speak of mental ill health. Yeah. And His Holiness was referring to a particular category of Buddhist concept of suffering, which is the third level of suffering, that's suffering of conditioning.
Yes.
And here it refers to a situation of being under the power of certain destructive tendency or destructive emotions, and that state is recognized as a form of suffering, of being conditioned. So the conditioning here refers to being, having no self-control and being under the sway of certain powerful destructive emotions.
From outside?
No, from within.
From within? From within. I mean, much of what I understood about this morning from His Holiness and from some of the happiness researchers was that one could practice in a certain way and change things to make your happiness or your sukha better. But we see people who get depressed, who get depressive illness, and it comes out of the blue. It just comes. Doesn't seem to have any cause. They didn't have difficult early lives. And sometimes these people, they feel very guilty, and they think this has come for a reason, even though we can't find any reason, and they feel that somehow they are to blame. I've had patients who are Buddhists who feel that they have become depressed because they haven't been good enough Buddhists, because they haven't followed the teachings closely enough. And yet they get better with treatment, which is essentially physical, which alters the brain. So I'm very interested in this point about the fact that there's mental well-being that you can pursue in a certain way, but mental ill health may be something that's different.
그러다 지금 디기디 간다 체도니 저연 좀네 세토기 와지 가나 버바스 생 나서디기디 디프레션 나도 좀 보지 그 삼류 땅땅 그 돈에 맞춘 봐 태가 이게 직대왕이 위에 들리는 것도 사실 인터뷰 때는 남부 쪽부터 되네 그 생각 나서 매산 펜에 펜도 벌써 그래서 도산을 군이 가가면 그래서 가가 여행해서 그러다가
전직 견사 쉬셨어요.
다 근데 생각 나서 내가 뇌도 되고 싶지 도도도 싶고
근데 디기 생장다 전에 아이들 씨 묘모제 생 장다치 아이메
되는 공부기 또 보고
꼭 하다 자 출발 때인데 찾으잖아요. 디 장나 삼다나 곧 터치보다 식식보다 발전해 소리래. this 가고도 돼. I think this is I think for me I think a new subject to think. My sort of my opinion, right? So far, those positive things, now happy or calm mind, this is positive. So those positive things, there is sound basis. Because there is sound basis, so we can further investigation or further training. So as a result, that will increase. Then those unhappy, now this is mainly mental level,
mental ill health.
Mental ill health. These basically, I think, based on illusion. So anything which
has no sound basis. Anything that has no sound basis.
More research, more investigate the basis than Shirudo.
Then the basis upon which it is built tends to be dismantled, to dissolve. Yeah.
Because
there is nothing supporting it. So from this point of view, one could say that so far as mental happiness...
This is of course from Buddhist viewpoint.
From the Buddhist point of view, mental happiness, one can envision a possibility of a limitless enhancement or increase, whereas the opposite, its opposite, which is the mental illness or mental suffering, is something that wouldn't have the potential for limitless growth.
So, but you raise some different questions.
So, but you are raising a very important and difficult question, which is, you are pointing out there might be a kind of a point of difference between the two. One has a more, for example, in the case of mental illness, you are pointing to the fact that sometimes it seems to come from nowhere, for no perceived psychological reasons.
Yes, I mean, I guess it's a bit like physical health. One can be physically healthy, but if you get hit by a truck, you're going to be ill because your bones are broken. Similarly, your mental health, you can live, you can follow the teachings and so on, but one could still get mentally ill.
That's true.
성향도 모습이지, 그스기 모습이, 그래서 모습이지, 그런데 라그메다고 검체, 인소론 발사.
In fact, there's a story of His Holiness was saying that it's a practitioner, a meditator, someone that His Holiness knows personally. As a result of focusing on a very specific type of Buddhist meditation on transient nature of life, impermanence of life, he began to feel, experienced early signs of depression. Yes. But this depression was treated through medication.
Yes, 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 yes. Yeah, do I have time for one more slide, Tony?
Maybe we'll reserve that till the end. Maybe
Okay,
we'll
sure.
transition, because I think again, this is a perfect segue into introducing Dr. Chopur's comments, because clearly Western medicine doesn't hold all the answers in its present form, and you may have some observations you wish to share with us. So please, we're going to, yeah. Thank you.
So first of all, Your Holiness, it's a very great privilege and honor to be in your presence. I think since I have straddled both worlds over the last 30 years, listening to Michael, listening to Alan, listening to all the people this morning, it's very obvious that the big puzzle, the little pieces are starting to fit, that we no longer try to have this schism between what is biology and what is consciousness, what is a molecule and what is a thought, or what's an emotion, that whatever happens in biology is reflected in the mind, whatever happens in the mind is reflected in the biology. That's becoming clear. The role of emotions and well-being, the role of happiness, of compassion, of love is becoming clear. We know that when people experience love and compassion, they feel safe. And when they feel safe and they feel settled and they feel calm, then there is better homeostasis in the body. The self-regulating mechanisms begin to act in such a way that the healing response is maximized. And yet, with all these strategies, we don't really have a full-blown holistic approach to healing. We don't. Some people emphasize drugs, some people emphasize cognitive behavioral therapy, some people say, oh, you just need love, or you change the environment. I think one of the great contributions of the Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Education can to begin to create that framework for healing, because ultimately the word healing is the same thing as the word holy. To be holy is to be healed. And to be holy is to see the complexity of everything. And I think one of the two very fundamental two very fundamental principles in Buddhist philosophy. One is that there's no such thing as a separate self. And the other is the interconnectedness of being. And we've been saying that, be compassionate, be loving, it helps. But how do we create that experience? So this is not a mood, that this is not a duty, this is not a moral dictum that I have to be loving and I have to be compassionate. And because I know that the Buddhist tradition and Vedanta are pretty much, come from the same wisdom tradition, I'm reminded of what we call yoga in our tradition, the yoga of being, the yoga of thinking, the yoga of feeling, and the yoga of action. To be, to feel, to think, and to act. And if we could develop a holistic practice that says, how can, being through meditation, feeling through compassion, understanding, thinking, cognitive behavioral therapies, and then taking the appropriate action, so we don't try to divide, whether this is better or that is better, but have an approach that says, look at everything.
진짜더래샤. 넬비기다 가소래. 지주로 세세 유디에 다 나만 너무 심지 안 되고. 진짜 그 주들이 그 차상 정도 야오사.
Definitely, given the fact that what is being treated is so complex. There's a complexity in the nature of what is being treated. Therefore, the approaches, the method that we will need to apply would also require all the complexity, recognition of all that complexity. So an integrated approach would be very helpful. And just as in medicine, for example, one treatment may be suitable and effective in the context of one patient, but that does not immediately translate into its applicability to another patient. And particularly, the situation gets more complex when we deal with mental illnesses, because the mental illnesses have such diverse sources and, based upon human constructs of the mind and imagination.
Thank you. To just move to the next subject here, which Michael kind of indicated, and he's the expert really on childhood experiences. We now know quite in very valid scientific terms that the nature of relationship between a mother and a baby actually develops the homeostatic mechanisms that give stability to the well-being of a child. And this relationship is through body language, through eye movement, through voice tone, through handling and cuddling and cooing and touching and play and all the things that are so crucial to the development of a baby that will influence the baby's physical and mental and emotional well-being. Shouldn't one of the strategies then be to really recognize, I heard His Holiness's tape, we were watching the video before we came, and he said the mother is the most important healer. I think as a society, shouldn't we be paying attention to elevating motherhood as the most sacred profession for the healing of arthritis?
Yes, that's very good.
My question is, if we made motherhood the most sacred profession on our planet, is there a possibility for world peace? Do you think, there's a saying in India by the great Indian poet Tagore, he says, every child that is born is proof that God has not yet given up on human beings. That even the most dangerous terrorist that exists on the planet today was once a child and was an innocent child. So are we not looking in the wrong places to find the long-term cure for violence in our world?
I think that basically promotion of the human values, I believe, long-term, that's the answer to these, to deal with this violence and all form of violence. I think violence usually motivated by hatred, anger, fear. So the opposition of these mental emotions or compassion. So long term, these are the, I think, only method to create more peaceful humanity, more compassionate humanity. That's my fundamental belief. So, it is really worthwhile make effort, whether achieved within this century or within our own lifetime. I don't think. I'm not expecting within the next 20, 30 years big change of this humanity. I don't think. But work, I think worthwhile to pursue. Then we feel, we try our best, no regret.
I think one of the reasons why the center is so important is that there is a sense of urgency right now with what is happening in the world. Information technologies are going to make even superpowers irrelevant. I was talking to some counter-terrorism experts and people who are looking at what the future of warfare is going to be. And somebody was saying that 10 years from now, you don't need conventional weapons or even nuclear weapons or biological weapons. All you'll have is, or you could use a little handheld computer, and by moving electrons, interfere with air traffic signals and hijack all the planes in the sky, or cut off electricity in the city, or interfere with pacemakers or respirators, or poison the food chain, or even cause a nuclear plant to leak, so that when a handheld computer held by a teenager, perhaps in a remote cave in a different part of the world, can do that, then a superpower becomes irrelevant. And unless we have a shift in our consciousness and see the inseparability of what's happening in the world, whether it's radical poverty in one part of the world or natural disasters. We look at something like Hurricane Katrina. We say it's a natural disaster, but we don't link it to oil rigs and disappearing marshlands or deforestation or global warming or oil consumption or even the war in Iraq. Then we are really approaching everything in a very fragmented manner. And the great contribution of Buddhism is that consciousness being the ground of being and our own awareness being the ground of being, and all suffering coming from the constricted self, even the 5 skandhas of the constricted self, the only long-term cure is to expand our awareness and begin to see the world from not the vantage point of the separate self, but the fact that there is no such thing as a separate self. It's an illusion, and if we can feel that and think that and be that and act that, there would be hope, if not in our lifetime, maybe at least in our children's and their children. I think His Holiness is extremely modest when he says, I don't want to discuss philosophy, Buddhist philosophy. Let's be very practical. But the philosophy of Buddhism is the most practical thing there is.
Nothing to say? Okay. So the purpose of this coming center is my sort of hope. There are organizations and also individuals who really feel I think the importance of our inner quality, our mental quality, and including some scientists, they actually carried some experiment, some positive result already now there. But this is something like scattered. So this is interest for humanity, not just this few groups or few cases. But generally, I think people just neglected about these values or this possibility. So somewhere they work coordinated way.
To bring together, to coordinate. Yeah.
Then make certain as a program or certain sort of proposal, clear proposal, and share wider institution or community. So that's main main purpose.
I think
and some of my sort of friends, they made one because they had the Dalai Lama Center. I just expressed, I don't like Dalai Lama Center. This center, nothing to do with promotion of my name or me, my thought. No, I'm just a contributor. Like you, all are those individual scientists or philosopher or thinker who have this same view or common interest, then come, make contribution and try to make some kind of vision. Give humanity, this is the one way to build better society, better world. So that's my main request.
You mentioned violence has so many forms, and right now I think the number one issue in the world is violence, and it all begins with violence in the individual, in the family, in the community, and ultimately spreads out there. We have done some studies on conflict resolution, and recently as part of the Gallup organization and my foundation, which is Alliance for a New Humanity, we have surveyed about 600 million people of the Islamic world recently in 10 countries. And what we came to, one of our findings was that the number one cause of rage in the world was lack of respect and humiliation. And that you can take somebody's money, you can even take their property, but if you humiliate them, they will never forgive you. And we also discovered that amongst the techniques for conflict resolution, respect comes number one. Recognizing that there is injustice on both sides is number two. Refraining from belligerence, not being emotionally intelligent, not respecting other people's values, proving them wrong. Proving them wrong, or introducing ideology or just your point of view, not having a role for forgiveness, are all the causes of conflict in the world. And when you look at national policies of the most powerful nations in the world, it seems like they're not following even one of these rules. But therefore, And I was looking at these rules and then just looking at the 8 Noble Truths. Right thinking, right perspective. This morning when you came, you said, oh, it's just my point of view. You don't have to take only my point of view as being the truth. Well, that is the Buddhist point of view, that, every point of view has to be respected. You are an embodiment of that. So, having the 8 Noble Truths and maybe even reframing them in a modern kind of context would offer really practical truths, whether it's right view or right thinking or right action or right mindfulness or right perspective. I think that's the value a center like this could bring to the world, and that's what education should be. Education should be what's already there in all of us.
It seems to me you are promoting Buddhism.
because I do not see Buddhism as a religion, but as a very practical way of understanding ourselves. And I see you as the embodiment, the bodhisattva of that great tradition. And I think this is the time to be saying what the truth is. It's not a dogma, it's not an ideology, but it's something that we should be speaking about as a universal truth.
Certainly, the coming center should be on the basis of secular principle. That's very important.
Well, thank you very much.
So, in sum, my friend, their understanding about secularism is something against religion. Rejection of religion. I think that's not the case. As far as I know, according Gandhian, I think, concept of secularism is respect all religion. Treat all religions, including non-believer, as a human brother, sisters. Respect. So then, between we two, I'm Tibetan, you are Indian. I always describe our relations between Tibetan and Indian is a relation like between teacher and student. We Tibetan are student, Indian are guru. Particularly, the Tibetan Buddhism is pure tradition of Nalanda tradition. So, I think, therefore, if you want to promote Buddhism, then you should carry that work in India. Because I always feel, and also telling my Indian friend, Buddhism is your religion, not we Tibetans. We learned from India. Buddhism is yours, the traditional path, your heritage.
In that case, with your permission, Your Holiness, I will do it.
nowadays, among young intellectual Indians, seems growing number, and also is some Indian scientists showing interest about Buddhist concept about Paticamuppada. Interconnectedness or
Dependent origination.
Or dependent origination.
Interdependent.
That's right. I think that's a very scientific sort of theory.
Concept.
Very scientific concept and very useful. Sometimes I told my Muslim friend, remain Muslim, believe Allah, but at the same time, useful to learn one of the Buddhist theory, that is the interdependency. Then their view could be wider. Useful. And businessmen also. Even those atheists who are very much against religion, they also should learn about the theory of Paticamuppada, so that their activities to against religion can be more effective.
Thank you. Well, and again, we didn't rehearse this, but we're right on time. We had a segment in here inviting His Holiness to share with us his final remarks. He anticipated that in the program, and I take those as your final remarks, Your Holiness. But if there's any message you'd like to leave with us by way of closure, this is the moment.
Oh, no, nothing left. Already spoke.
Good, yeah.
So finally, I very appreciate the organizer and also those panelists, speakers, including those young students. I very much appreciate. And 2 days our meeting, I found, of course, the language difficulties, my limitation of my knowledge, knowledge of this English word. That's, of course, difficulties. But basically, enriched my knowledge. Very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Then I consider this kind of meeting is not just a mere meeting where the scholarship
I feel that this kind of meeting should not be simply a forum for showing how much we know.
No. We are, I think, passing through certain, critical time. Right. I think 20th century, in any case, it become a century of war, century of violence, century of bloodshed. Now, this century, although the way beginning of this century, not very, very healthy one, but still, I think on the level of the ordinary people, I think very few people, really believe violent method is the right thing. It seems now, I think the movement against war, against nuclear weapon, these, I think, everywhere, east and west and everywhere, I think, growing. So this is the, I think, hopeful sign. The public level, I think, real desire for peace, no longer any bloodshed. And that's growing. That's, I think, a very healthy sign. So meantime, some disagreement, some problems bound to happen. So we need some kind of effective method to solve this problem, as you mentioned, was peaceful resolution. But through dialogue. In order to carry meaningful dialogue, first you must understand others' interest, and you must respect them as a human brothers and sisters, and also consider them as a part of yourself. If you make it clear demarcation, they and we, they 100% black, we 100% white, then there is no room of meaningful dialogue. Dialogue using force, through force, showing force. No meaningful dialogue. So, in the political field or economic field and everywhere, I think firstly we need genuine, because the political will or the will to carry meaningful dialogue. There, tolerance, patience, determination, these are a very important element. All these elements rooted on compassion. Consider them as a human being, same just like myself. They also have every right to overcome suffering, to achieve happiness. So therefore, our work, try to promote awareness of these inner quality, create a new society, then leadership, politicians, including military personnel, come from that kind of society, certainly will be more compassionate politician, compassionate engineer, compassionate military leaders. I think that's our long-term, strategy. So therefore, I really appreciate all speakers, and now hopefully speakers not only just to speak some wonderful thing, but do something, make effort. So we need, in positive sense, some kind of comrade, work hard, united. That's important. This is my feeling, my hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
Then I think, so no. Still one word. Lastly, now this is real last now. Lastly, you audience here, and particularly those, I think, younger people, I think you should know you have similar sort of potential and responsibility, and work together. Come out, work together. That's very important. You should not feel just a listener, doing nothing, not that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Just like the participants from this morning, if they could join us on stage. Well, what a wonderful treat. We started out hoping to have a scientific dialogue around happiness and stress, and what we ended up with was a formula for world peace. And we have our homework. You know, we all have to be part of this effort, and not just sit and listen, but also to act. So now this is the most wonderful part of the proceedings for the participants, because His Holiness is gracious enough to give thanks to the participants, and we thank him from all our hearts for his participation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful.
We got the chemistry.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
I see you in Vancouver.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Can we have what?
Talk.
One for the lady.
Photograph of the group.